Welcome to History's Hidden Weird, the podcast that peels back the dusty curtain of the past to reveal the strange, the surreal, and the downright unbelievable stories you weren't taught in school. I'm your host, Quinn Strange. And today, we're unpacking a tale that's part Prison Break, part comedy of errors, and entirely real. It's the story of the man who tried to mail himself to Australia. Yeah. You heard that right. He mailed himself. In a box. Across continents. Let's dig in. Our story starts in 1965, with a young man named Brian Robson, just 19 years old, and originally from Cardiff, Wales. Now, Brian was one of the many young Brits who joined the Assisted Passage Migration Scheme, a post-war program that promised cheap travel and new opportunities in Australia. For just £10, the British government would ship you halfway across the world. In return, you'd agree to stay and work in Australia for at least 2 years. Sounds like a good deal, right? Well, Brian thought so too. But once he arrived in Melbourne and started working for the Victorian Railways, things went south fast. The job was grueling. The homesickness hit hard. And Brian found himself deeply unhappy, lonely, broke, and desperate to go home. There was just one problem. Quitting the job meant breaking the terms of the agreement, which meant no help with a return ticket. And Brian couldn't afford one on his own. So, he hatched a plan. A bold, ridiculous, potentially fatal plan. He would mail himself home. In a box. Brian didn't come up with the idea completely on his own. There was buzz about a man named Reg Spears, an Australian athlete who'd apparently mailed himself from the UK back to Australia in 1964 and survived the trip. Brian thought, if he can do it, why can't I? So he recruited 2 Irish mates, Paul and John, fellow travelers who were just reckless enough to help him pull it off. They found a wooden crate, about the size of a mini fridge, 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 2.5 feet high. They stocked it with essentials. A suitcase. A flashlight. A hammer. A bottle for, well, bathroom breaks. A pillow and a blanket. And, of course, a small breathing hole drilled into the side. The plan was to label the box as computer equipment, ship it as air freight via Qantas, and have Brian arrive in London a couple days later, shaken, sore, but free. Simple, right? Oh, if only. On the day of the Great Escape, Paul and John helped nail Brian inside the box. Let that sink in. They nailed their friend into a crate, shook his hand through a hole, and handed him over to a cargo carrier. What followed was 5 days of claustrophobic chaos. The box was not handled gently. It was dropped. It was turned upside down. At one point, it was left upside down for 22 hours straight, with Brian's legs above his head and his circulation slowly being cut off. He nearly passed out. He later said he seriously thought he was going to die in that box. Worse still, instead of going straight to London, the crate was mistakenly loaded onto a Pan Am flight headed to Los Angeles. Yep. He was trying to get to the UK, and ended up in America. And there, in an LA cargo hangar, things finally fell apart. It was in Los Angeles, after 92 hours inside the crate, that a sharp-eyed baggage handler noticed something weird. The box was marked fragile, this side up, and computer equipment, but it had been loaded upside down. Then someone saw movement. Someone heard a noise. And someone called security. Soon, a group of confused airport workers opened the crate. To find a sweaty, pale, half-delirious teenager inside, holding a flashlight and blinking in the Californian sun. Brian tried to explain. The Americans were baffled. Some thought it was a prank, others a spy operation. The FBI got involved. Immigration officers took him in. And for a brief moment, it looked like Brian might be in serious legal trouble. But once the full story came out, the homesickness, the desperation, the terrible job in Melbourne, the Americans did something remarkable. They let him go. In fact, Pan Am flew him first class back to London. No box. No nails. Just a seat, a tray table, and an amazing story to tell. Back in the UK, Brian was greeted as a sort of folk hero. The media loved the story. The guy who mailed himself home, it was just too weird, too funny, too unbelievable to ignore. But here's the twist. For decades, Brian didn't talk about it. He was embarrassed. He felt foolish. And he worried about how people would see him, not as brave, but as stupid. It wasn't until more than 50 years later, in 2021, that Brian finally told the full story in a memoir titled The Great Escape. And even better? He reunited with Paul and John, the two friends who helped him. They hadn't seen each other since that day in 1965. They had no idea if Brian had even survived. And when they finally met again, over Zoom, they laughed. They cried. They remembered how ridiculous, and dangerous, and unforgettable the whole thing had been. So what do we make of all this? Brian Robson's story is part comedy, part tragedy, and part cautionary tale. It's about a desperate teenager in a strange land who felt so alone, so out of options, that climbing into a wooden box seemed like the best way out. It's a story of youthful recklessness, international mishaps, and the human desire, above all else, to go home. And it reminds us that history isn't just kings and wars and treaties. Sometimes, history is a guy in a crate with a bottle of water and a hammer, hoping nobody notices he's breathing. Thanks for listening to History's Hidden Weird. I'm Quinn Strange. If you liked today's tale, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. We'll be back next time with another strange story from the shadows of history. If you liked today's episode, leave a review, share with your weird history-loving friends, and hit follow. Have a strange story you want us to cover? Comment below and we will see what we can do. Until then, stay curious, stay weird, and don't try to mail yourself anywhere.